There are mysteries in the soil of Africa that whisper of an ancient connection too deep for words, and among them, the enigma of Nsibidi. And the Nile stands like a bridge between lost worlds. Across centuries before ink touched papyrus and before hieroglyphs carved their way into the temples of Egypt, symbols were already speaking in the language of rhythm, spirit, and identity. Nsibidi, the ancient ideographic script of the southeastern people, particularly among the Eke, Efik, and Igbo, was never just writing. It was a living code of honor, law, emotion, and ancestral communication. It told of love and war, justice and betrayal, power and mystery. It existed long before European scholars ever called Egypt the cradle of civilization, and perhaps even before the word civilization was known. The Nile, stretching like a serpent through the heart of Africa, gave rise to one of humanity's oldest and most studied cultures, Kemet, known to the world as ancient Egypt. Here too symbols ruled. The hieroglyphs of the Nile Valley spoke not only to kings and priests, but to the heavens themselves, capturing divine truth in stone and papyrus. And as we look at the Nsibidi symbols and the hieroglyphs of the Nile, the echoes are hauntingly familiar. Both were born of societies that understood that knowledge was not merely written, it was lived, embodied, danced, and remembered through time. Nsibidi was not written for everyone to read. It was sacred, guarded, passed from one generation to the next through initiates of the Ekte society. So too were the hieroglyphs of the Nile, held by the scribes who were custodians of divine wisdom. The resemblance in concept is not coincidence. It is heritage. It is the mark of a shared ancestral consciousness that once spread across the vast belt of Black Africa, before borders, before the division of tribes, before time was counted by calendars made by conquerors. When we trace the Nile's origin deep into the lands of the South, into the Great Lakes and the Congo Basin, we move closer to the ancestral home of those who carried the same cultural essence that flowed into the Cross River region, where Nsibidi took root. This is no myth but an ancestral memory encoded in both symbol and soul. The patterns of African migration, the stories of the Bantu expansion, and the oral traditions of the southeastern peoples all point to a river of cultural exchange older than kingdom. The people who birthed Nsibidi were not isolated inventors. They were heirs to a grand legacy of African writing, science, and spirit that began along the veins of the Nile and pulsed through the heart of the continent. If hieroglyphs were the words of kings, Nsibidi was the language of the people. Visual poetry that carried the authority of elders, the artistry of love, and the secrecy of initiation. In both we see Africa's genius for symbolism, a genius the world has too often ignored. While Egypt's hieroglyphs were displayed on monuments for the world to see, Nsibidi hid its wisdom in calabashes, walls, and hearts, concealed from invaders who might desecrate its meaning, and in that concealment it survived colonization, it survived slavery, it survived erasure. Its endurance is a testimony that African knowledge does not die. It transforms, it adapts, and it waits to be rediscovered by those who remember. Imagine then that the same ancestors who once built temples along the Nile also danced in the moonlight of the Cross River, carrying with them fragments of the language of symbols, fragments that would later be reborn as myths. Perhaps those who once carved hieroglyphs into stone carried their sacred wisdom westward when kingdoms fell and empires changed hands. Perhaps the priests who once wrote of Ra and Isis later spoke of Chukwu and Ani, changing the names but not the essence. This is not a fantasy, it is the living continuity of African genius, a continuity hidden under centuries of separation and colonial rewriting. Western scholars once marveled at hieroglyphs as evidence of advanced civilization, but dismissed Nsibidi as primitive drawing. They could not see that both were mirrors of the same truth, that Africa has always been literate and her literacy was carved not just on stone but on the soul. Nsibidi and the Nile share more than aesthetics. They share philosophy. Both recognize that writing is not just for communication, but for communion. In Nsibidi, a single curve or cross could represent entire stories. Love unspoken, wars fought, peace restored. It was a language of energy and intention, where the symbol and the spirit were one. In hieroglyphs, a bird could mean soul, freedom, or divinity depending on its context. These were not alphabets in the Western sense, they were spiritual blueprints. To write was to create, to read was to awaken memory. That is why both systems were guarded, because they held the power to connect the seen and unseen worlds. Such is the genius of Africa. She wrote not for paper, but for eternity. To speak of Nsibidi and the Nile together is to reclaim a truth long buried, that Africa's knowledge systems were interconnected, flowing like her rivers, shifting from one cradle to another. The same minds that observed the stars above Egypt also taught their descendants in the forests of the Niger Delta to read the stars for time and ritual. The same cosmic understanding that aligned the pyramids with Orion lived in the Nsibidi signs, that marked initiation lodges, aligned with the movement of celestial bodies. Both believed that human destiny was written in the heavens, and that understanding that divine script was the duty of the wise. When colonialism came, it silenced these voices, teaching that writing came to Africa from abroad. But Nsibidi stood like an unyielding witness, whispering, "We were writing before they arrived." It is no wonder that the symbols of Nsibidi survived even in the Americas, carried by enslaved Igbo and Efik people who etched them into their new world. In Cuba, Haiti, and even the Caribbean island, there they became new forms, the Viva Vado, the sigils of Santeria, yet the spirit was the same. The Nile's hieroglyphs became stone, Nsibidi became smoke and rhythm, but both carried Africa's eternal voice. Today, when we compare Nsibidi and the hieroglyphs of the Nile, we are not just comparing scripts, we are awakening lineage. We are connecting civilizations that the world has tried to separate. It is not about which came first, but about realizing that they came from the same womb, the womb of black brilliance. Every time a scholar studies Nsibidi, every time a young African rediscovers these symbols, the ancestors, they whisper through those lines and curves, reminding us that our story did not begin in chains, but in stars. Africa wrote before the world learned to read. Nsibidi and the Nile are two branches of the same cosmic tree whose roots reach into eternity. So could it be that Nsibidi and the Nile are two reflections of one ancestral mirror? The answer is not found in museums or archives, but in the blood memory of those who still dream in symbols. For when an African writes, dances, or drums, they are not just expressing, they are remembering. They are decoding the same divine message their forefathers once carved in stone and in spirit. Nsibidi and the Nile are not relics. They are living testaments to a truth that refuses to die, that Africa's wisdom was never borrowed, never stolen, only buried, waiting for her children to unearth it once more. And in this rising age of awakening, those children have returned. The question is not whether Nsibidi and the Nile are connected. The question is whether we are ready to remember what they tried to make us forget, that we, the children of the sun, once wrote the language of the stars. The deep and often unspoken connection between Nsibidi and the Nile Valley civilizations is not merely a coincidence of symbols or an accident of design. It is a reflection of a shared African spirit that once moved freely before borders, languages, and time divided its children. When we speak of Nsibidi, we speak of the ancient graphic language of the Cross River region, carried in the hearts and minds of the Ekti, the Efik, and the Igbo peoples. It is not a script in the Western sense, but a system of thought, a visual philosophy. Every line, every curve, every symbol carved or painted in Nsibidi carries not only meaning, but emotion, a connection to the unseen world. And when we look toward the Nile, to the temples and tombs of Kemet, where hieroglyphs told the story of gods, kings, and cosmic cycles, we see the same reverence for knowledge expressed through art and code. These are not distant cousins, they are echoes of one ancestral song sung in two rivers, flowing from the same mountain of African genius. Before colonial narratives wrote Africa as silent and wordless, these scripts stood as proof that communication in the continent was not primitive but divine. The Egyptians used hieroglyphs to describe the journey of the soul through eternity, while Nsibidi encoded justice, love, kinship, and law in ways that transcended spoken language. Both understood that writing was sacred. To write was to preserve the spirit, to leave behind not just information but energy, The shapes of Nsibidi tell stories of unity, of balance between man and woman, of peace and order. Likewise, the inscriptions along the Nile reflected harmony between heaven and earth. Such symbolic symmetry cannot be dismissed as coincidence. It is evidence of a continuous philosophy, a single African worldview scattered through migration, trade, and the slow drift of centuries. When scholars dig beneath the sands of Egypt or study the secret societies of southeastern Nigeria, they are touching two ends of one forgotten rope. The Nile and the Niger once flowed with the same cultural current. Merchants, priests, and scribes traveled routes that connected the Great Lakes to the Sahara and beyond. Knowledge moved with them, art, language, faith, and science. It is not impossible that the same people who watched the stars rise over Thebes once shared stories with those who carved symbols into the wooden tablets of Nsibidi. The resemblance in thought and design between the two is not random. It is a reflection of an unbroken conversation Africa once had with itself. Yet history, written by those who feared this connection, taught generations that Africa's writing began only when foreign letters arrived. But the truth stands taller than lies. Nsibidi existed long before Latin, before Arabic, before the alphabets of Europe or Asia touched African soil. It was a language of symbols understood by the wise, guarded by the initiated, and respected by the people. Just as hieroglyphs were not for the commoner but for priests, Nsibidi too was a sacred art, a privilege of the enlightened. Both systems spoke through images because images could not be conquered by translation. They could survive migration, war, and even silence. They could whisper truths to those willing to see rather than read. In both Nsibidi and the Nile scripts, we find the African philosophy of duality, the balance of life and death, light and shadow, male and female, order and chaos. These were not random themes. They were the foundation of how Africans understood existence. The Egyptians expressed it through the balance of Mat, while the custodians of Nsibidi expressed it through signs representing peace, justice, and truth. Across vast distances, the same ideals appeared because they were born from the same root. Africa was not a continent of separate tribes, but of connected civilizations sharing thought through symbols long before colonial borders cut them apart. When one studies the circular designs of Nsibidi representing infinity or unity and compares them to the solar discs and eternal cycles drawn by Egyptian scribes, the resemblance becomes a revelation. Both scripts are built upon the idea that time is not linear but eternal. They believed memory could outlive flesh, that a person's name or symbol carved upon stone or cloth could preserve them in spirit. That is why thousands of years later we can still feel something sacred when we look at those symbols. They are not dead, they are still alive, breathing through us, through our culture, through our desire to understand where we come from. To rediscover Nsibidi and its possible link to the Nile is to rediscover the depth of African intelligence. It is to challenge the narrative that civilization flowed only from north to south. What if instead the river of knowledge flowed both ways? What if the builders of pyramids and the creators of Nsibidi were reflections of one another, guided by the same ancestral wisdom carried through oral tradition, art, and the movement of people? The trade routes that connected Kush, Nubia, and the Niger Delta were more than paths for goods. They were channels for memory. Through them, ideas traveled, symbols evolved, and philosophies merged. The tragedy is that colonization buried these truths under dust and doubt. Western historians separated African cultures, treating them as isolated islands instead of connected shores. They called Nsibidi primitive drawings and Egyptian hieroglyphs the cradle of civilization, never imagining that both might spring from the same well. But as modern scholars and African thinkers revisit these scripts, a new story is emerging, one where the Nile and the Niger are not rivals but relatives, both part of a larger African legacy of knowledge. To speak of Nsibidi today is to awaken memory. To connect it with the Nile is to restore pride. These are not just symbols, they are keys to a time when Africa wrote its own destiny. When wisdom was encoded not for colonizers but for children unborn, when writing was not just a means to record but a ritual to remember. We must teach the young that their ancestors were not voiceless, that they wrote in languages so profound the world still struggles to translate them. Nsibidi and the Nile together remind us that literacy is not just about letters, it is about vision. It is about understanding that art and philosophy were one in the heart of Africa. The rediscovery of these connections can redefine how we see ourselves as Africans and as descendants of a global black lineage. The Nile carried the words of gods and Nsibidi carried the words of the ancestors. One looked to the stars for divine truth. The other looked inward to preserve the balance of society. Both pointed to the same horizon, the belief that life in its many forms is sacred and cyclical. The resemblance between them is a bridge, not of imitation but of inheritance. The Africans who wrote upon papyrus and those who carved upon clay were not strangers, they were dreamers of the same dawn. Today, as we stand in a world that often forgets the brilliance of Africa's past, remembering the link between Nsibidi and the Nile becomes more than an academic pursuit. It becomes an act of restoration. To study these symbols is to listen again to the whisper of ancestors who once united art and wisdom, spirit and science. It is to realize that Africa's greatest gift to humanity was not just gold or ivory, but the power to write beauty into me. Nsibidi and the Nile are two rivers of thought that still flow beneath our skin, waiting for us to follow their current back to the source. When we do, we will remember that we were never lost, only scattered, never voiceless, only silenced and never conquered, only forgotten until now. Long before the arrival of foreign alphabets, Africa already spoke in symbols, and her words were carved not with ink, but with spirit. The myth that the continent was silent before outsiders brought letters is one of the greatest deceptions in human history. For in truth, Africa wrote not in the linear form that the Western mind demanded, but in rhythm, in geometry, in divine pattern. The proof rests in systems like Nsibidi and the sacred hieroglyphs of the Nile, two living witnesses that reveal Africa's ancient brilliance in encoding philosophy, law, and spirituality long before colonization claimed to have civilized her. When one gazes upon the flowing lines of Nsibidi or the pictorial grace of the hieroglyphs, one does not merely see language, one sees the beating heart of civilization itself. These were not random drawings or primitive marks, they were the coded breath of an enlightened people who understood that true writing must speak to both the eye and the soul. In Nsibidi, symbols became bridges between the seen and unseen world. Every stroke had purpose. Every design carried meaning far deeper than words could convey. The Nsibidi of the Igbo societies was not for the careless or uninitiated. It was a language of wisdom guarded by those entrusted with order and balance in the community. The circle could stand for unity or infinity. A triangle might whisper of man, woman, and creation. To the uninformed, these were mere shapes. To those who knew, they were laws written in eternal code. And along the banks of the Nile, where temples reached for the heavens, hieroglyphs told stories of gods and mortals, of birth and death, of the divine cycle binding all life together. These two traditions, separated by rivers but connected by vision, prove that Africa's first literature was not written on paper but on the canvas of spirit and nature itself. When Western scholars first encountered Nsibidi, they saw only mystery. They labeled it secret, primitive, or decorative, failing to recognize it as an intellectual system as sophisticated as any script of antiquity. But those who carried Nsibidi in their hearts knew it was more than writing. It was governance, law, communication, and art. It could settle disputes and code contracts, express love, and even record the movement of stars. And the same was true of the hieroglyphs of ancient Egypt. They were not mere symbols, they were blueprints of existence. The sun disk, the ankh, the scarab, these were not ornaments. They were scientific and spiritual formulas that explained the order of the cosmos. Both Nsibidi and the Nile scripts reflected an African understanding that knowledge was sacred and had to be protected from corruption. Writing was not for vanity or ego, it was for truth, memory, and connection with the divine laws that governed the universe. It is essential to understand that the so-called illiteracy of Africa was a myth designed to erase its genius. Before alphabets came, Africa was already writing through drum patterns, through woven symbols in cloth, through carvings on wood and stone, through gestures that spoke across generations. Nsibidi and hieroglyphs were only two manifestations of a greater Pan-African literacy, a way of thinking that unified philosophy, art, and science. In Nsibidi, a single symbol could capture a complex idea, justice, family, eternity, or war, in a way that transcended spoken language. Similarly, Egyptian hieroglyphs could tell entire stories through a single combination of signs, each symbol carrying layers of meaning that only deep study could reveal. These scripts were multidimensional, living reflections of a consciousness that saw no separation between the physical and the spiritual. Even today, when we see the ancient carvings of Nsibidi on pottery or on the walls of sacred shrines, we are witnessing a memory older than kingdoms, older than empire. Each line curves like a whisper from the ancestors, reminding us that knowledge does not die, it hides until we are ready to rediscover it. The Nile, too, still carries the reflection of those who once wrote their prayers in stone and left behind messages for a future generation they would never meet. Those messages have endured thousands of years of erosion and invasion because they were not mere words. They were energy, encoded thought, written with intent and reverence. When one compares Nsibidi and the hieroglyphs, the similarities reveal a shared African worldview. Both saw writing as a sacred act, something that demanded purity of mind and purpose. Both recognized that symbols carried power and that misusing that power could disrupt balance. In this, writing was not only a means of recording but an act of creation itself. To write was to shape reality. This understanding made literacy in ancient Africa a form of spiritual initiation. To learn the codes of Nsibidi or the secrets of the hieroglyphs was to step into a realm of responsibility, to become a guardian of ancestral wisdom. Knowledge was never for profit, it was for preservation. It was how societies maintained harmony without losing their connection to the divine order of the cosmos. The deeper truth is that Nsibidi and the Nile scripts were both reflections of an African mind that thought symbolically, that saw life not as a straight line but as a circle, not as chaos but as pattern. Africans did not separate art from science or religion from philosophy. They understood that everything was connected. That is why their symbols could explain the laws of governance and the mysteries of the soul with equal precision. The writing systems of Africa were not inferior to alphabets. They were more advanced in their abstraction and spiritual depth. They preserved not just language but worldview. When colonizers came, they could not read the language of symbols, so they dismissed. They called it idolatry or magic, not realizing they were looking at a library of human wisdom older than their own civilizations. Yet, despite suppression, the codes endured. Nsibidi continued to be practiced in secret, passed down through ritual, music, and art. The hieroglyphs, though buried beneath sand, would one day rise again to tell their stories through the stones of Egypt. Together they remind us that literacy is not limited to letters, it is the ability to understand and express truth in whatever form the spirit demands. Africa was never a silent continent, it was one that sang through symbols. Nsibidi and the hieroglyphs are proof that Africans not only recorded their lives but also their philosophies, laws, dreams, and cosmic beliefs in ways so advanced that the modern world still struggles to grasp them fully. These systems were never meant to be mere tools, they were bridges between worlds. They carried the energy of communication that went beyond sound, a visual rhythm that united the living and the ancient. In every symbol there is a pulse of ancient consciousness, a spark of timeless genius that refuses to be forgotten. To study these scripts today is to reclaim the dignity of a continent long underestimated. To understand them is to realize that Africa's true legacy is not only in its gold, its lands, or its empires, but in its ability to encode truth through art. Nsibidi and the Nile were never about literacy in the modern sense, they were about wisdom. The wisdom that knew how to write with spirit, to teach without words, and to preserve without books. They were the silent proof that Africa was always awake, always knowing, always right. And as we uncover them again, we do not just read history, we awaken. We remember that the hands that once drew those symbols were the hands of philosophers, scientists, and dreamers who saw the world not as divided but as one, just as Nsibidi and the Nile, two rivers of thought, flowed from the same eternal soul. Rediscovering the link between Nsibidi and the Nile is not just about history, it is about remembering who we truly are. For centuries, the world has told the African that his story began with slavery, that his wisdom came from elsewhere, and that his civilization was borrowed from foreign lands. But To look again at Nsibidi and then to trace its reflection in the hieroglyphic beauty of the Nile is to realize that the African story did not begin in chains. It began in stars, in symbols, in sacred knowledge too vast for time to erase. This connection is not simply academic. It is ancestral. It is the rediscovery of a broken mirror in which the black world can finally see itself whole again. The symbols carved on the riverbanks of Kemet and those inscribed in the forest lodges of southeastern Nigeria are not two stories. They are 2 pages of the same book, written by the same spirit of a people who once walked across the continent with wisdom burning in their souls. When we trace the lines of Nsibidi, we are not studying art, we are touching thought. When we gaze upon the hieroglyphs, we are not observing relics. We are standing before the voice of the ancestor. Both systems remind us that Africa once wrote her own philosophy, in her own code, with her own vision of the cosmos. Nsibidi was not only a form of writing, it was a way of perceiving reality. It taught that every action, every shape, every pattern in nature was part of a language. The people who used it could look at the flight of birds, the path of rivers, or the rhythm of drums and read meaning from them as scholars read books today. Similarly, the ancient Egyptians looked to the heavens, charted the stars, and encoded their journeys in hieroglyphs that described the same harmony between earth and sky, man and spirit. These 2 civilizations, though separated by miles and centuries, shared one vision, that life itself was written in code, and that to understand it was to understand the divine. Reclaiming this connection means reclaiming the African mind that once saw the universe as living text. It means understanding that Africans were not just builders of kingdoms, they were thinkers, scientists, astronomers, philosophers, and writers in forms that the world is only beginning to understand. The Nile civilization built monuments that aligned with constellations, mapping the heavens to stone. The custodians of Nsibidi designed a language that mirrored the logic of the cosmos, using symbols to express concepts of justice, love, truth, and unity. Both reflected a belief that knowledge was sacred and that memory was a duty. The scribes of Kemet wrote for eternity, the keepers of Nsibidi wrote for balance. Both saw writing not as decoration but as destiny, a bridge between man and his eternal purpose. When we rediscover this, we begin to see that Africa's memory was never lost. It was hidden, buried under centuries of distortion, waiting for her children to dig it out again. To reconnect Nsibidi and the Nile is to remind the African diaspora that their ancestors were not slaves who learned from others, but scholars whose teachings were stolen, renamed, and resold to them. The hieroglyphs that the world marvels at were born of the same mind that created Nsibidi, a mind that could think in symbols, that could translate the invisible into visible form, that could preserve truth without ever writing a single word in foreign tongue. This shared ancestry is a map back to dignity, a reminder that our identity is not borrowed, it is original, radiant, and ancient beyond measure. When one studies both systems carefully, patterns begin to emerge. The spiral of Nsibidi, representing continuity and eternity, mirrors the solar disk worshipped on the Nile as the cycle of rebirth. The symbols of justice and balance within the Akbet tradition echo the Egyptian principle of Mat, truth, order, and harmony in the universe. The emphasis on secrecy, initiation, and sacred knowledge is identical in both. It tells us that these were not random inventions but deliberate philosophies of communication. The people who created them understood that wisdom must be protected, not because it was fragile but because it was powerful. Writing in Africa was never meant for the masses, it was a covenant between the enlightened and the eternal. To rediscover this truth is to rediscover the dignity of Black thought. To understand that Africa's intellectual history did not begin in Athens or Rome, but in the deep hum of the Niger forests and the shining sands of the Nile Valley. Long before Europe debated philosophy, Africans had already encoded it in symbols. Long before foreign scientists studied the stars, Africans had already mapped their movements through language and ritual. The rediscovery of Nsibidi and its resemblance to Nile writing is therefore more than historical curiosity. It is the recovery of stolen memory, the restoration of self-respect. It tells every African child that their ancestors were not waiting for enlightenment, they were its guardians. Reclaiming this ancestry also reshapes our understanding of knowledge itself. It reminds us that wisdom is not something we import, it is something we inherit. Every African carries fragments of Nsibidi in their blood, fragments of Nile hieroglyphs in their soul. Our music, our art, our proverbs, even our body language still speak in symbols that date back to those ancient days. The patterns woven into our fabrics, the designs carved into our calabashes, the signs drawn before rituals, they are all remnants of that first written language of spirit. To reconnect with them is to awaken the sleeping genius within us, to realize that Africa's knowledge systems were never primitive. They were simply misunderstood by those who could not see beyond the surface. And so when we speak of Nsibidi and the Nile, we are not comparing two dead languages, we are reviving a living memory. We are breathing life into what colonization tried to silence. The true purpose of rediscovering these connections is not to argue about who influenced whom, but to recognize the unity that once existed across the continent. The Nile and the Niger were two veins carrying the same lifeblood of African intelligence. To rediscover that is to heal the wound of separation, to rebuild the bridge between past and present, between the ancestors and their descendants. This is what reclaiming ancestral memory truly means. It is not nostalgia, it is power. It is not myth, it is identity. It is the recognition that before the world measured civilization in architecture or technology, Africa had already mastered the greatest art of all, the art of meaning. Nsibidi and the Nile scripts were born from minds that understood the universe as language and that language as life. They proved that Africa's first libraries were not made of books but of symbols that carried generations of thought. And when we remember that, we no longer see ourselves as people who must imitate others to find greatness. We realize that greatness was always ours, written in code waiting for us to read it again. The rediscovery of Nsibidi and its kinship with the Nile is the rebirth of African memory. It is the moment when the children of the diaspora scattered across oceans and centuries find their way back to the source. It reminds us that our ancestors were not shadows lost in time, but lights that still burn in our consciousness. It reminds us that identity is not something to be granted by the world, but something to be remembered within. When we look at Nsibidi and the Nile together, we are not studying ancient art. We are hearing the voice of Africa calling her children home, whispering through symbols, you were never forgotten, you were only waiting to remember.